Letter 17. While we were only engaged in deducing the universal idea of beauty from the conception of human nature in general, we had only to consider in the latter the limits established essentially in itself, and inseparable from the notion of the finite, without attending to the contingent restrictions that human nature may undergo in the real world of phenomena. We have drawn the conception of this nature directly from reason, as the source of every necessity, and the ideal of beauty has been given us, at the same time, with the ideal of humanity. But now we are coming down from the region of ideas to the scene of reality, to find man in a determinate state, and consequently in limits which are not derived from the pure conception of humanity, but from external circumstances and from an accidental use of his freedom. But although the limitation of the idea of humanity may be very manifold in the individual, the contents of this idea suffice to teach us that we can only depart from it by two opposite roads. For if the perception of man consists in the harmonious energy of his sensuous and spiritual forces, he can only lack this perfection through the want of harmony and the want of energy. Thus, then, before having received on this point the testimony of experience, reason suffices to assure us that we shall find the real and consequently limited man in a state of tension or relaxation, according as the exclusive activity of isolated forces troubles the harmony of his being, or as the unity of his nature is based on the uniform relaxation of his physical and spiritual forces. These opposite limits are, as we have now to prove, suppressed by the beautiful, which reestablishes harmony in man when excited, and energy in man when relaxed, and which, in this way, in conformity with the nature of the beautiful, restores the state of limitation to an absolute state, and makes of man a whole, complete in himself. Thus the beautiful by no means belies in reality the idea which we have made of it in speculation. Only its action is much less free in it than in the field of theory, where we were able to apply it to the pure conception of humanity. In man, as experience shows him to us, the beautiful finds a matter already damaged and resisting, which robs him in ideal perfection of what it communicates to him of his individual mode of being. Accordingly, in reality, the beautiful will always appear in a peculiar and limited species, and not as the pure genus. In excited minds, in a state of tension, it will lose its freedom and variety. In relaxed minds, it will lose its vivifying force. But we, who have become familiar with the true character of this contradictory phenomenon, cannot be led astray by it. We shall not follow the great crowd of critics in determining their conception by separate experiences, and to make them answerable for the deficiencies which man shows under their influence. We know rather that it is man who transfers the imperfections of his individuality over to them, who stands perpetually in the way of their perfection by his subjective limitation, and lowers their absolute ideal to two limited forms of phenomena. It was advanced that soft beauty is for an unstrung mind, and the energetic beauty for the tightly strung mind. But I apply the term unstrung to a man when he is rather under the pressure of feelings than under the pressure of conceptions. Every exclusive sway of one of his two fundamental impulses is, for a man, a state of compulsion and violence, and freedom only exists in the cooperation of his two natures. Accordingly, the man governed preponderantly by feelings or sensuously unstrung is emancipated and set free by matter. The soft and graceful beauty, to satisfy this twofold problem, must therefore show herself under two aspects, in two distinct forms. First, as a form and response, she will tone down savage life and pave the way from feeling to thought. She will, secondly, as a living image, equip the abstract form with sensuous power and lead back the conception to intuition and law to feeling. The former service she does to the man of nature, the second to the man of art. But because she does not, in both cases, hold complete sway over her matter, but depends on that which is furnished, either by formless nature or unnatural art, she will in both cases bear traces of her origin and lose herself in one place, in material life, and in another, in mere abstract form. To be able to arrive at a conception how beauty can become a means to remove this twofold relaxation, we must explore its source in the human mind. Accordingly, make up your mind to dwell a little longer in the region of speculation, in order then to leave it forever, and to advance with secure footing on the ground of experience. Letter 18. By beauty, the sensuous man is led to form and to thought. By beauty, the spiritual man is brought back to matter and restored to the world of sense. From this statement, it would appear to follow that between matter and form, between passivity and activity, there must be a middle state, and that beauty plants us in this state. It actually happens that the greater part of mankind really form this conception of beauty as soon as they begin to reflect on its operations, and all experience seems to point to this conclusion. But, on the other hand, nothing is more unwarrantable and contradictory than such a conception, because the aversion of matter and form, the passive and the active, feeling and thought, is eternal and cannot be mediated in any way. How can we remove this contradiction? Beauty weds the two opposed conditions of feeling and thinking, and yet there is absolutely no medium between them. The former is immediately certain through experience, the other through the reason. This is the point to which the whole question of beauty leads, and if we succeed in settling this point in a satisfactory way, we have, at length, found the clue that will conduct us through the whole labyrinth of aesthetics. But this requires two very different operations, which must necessarily support each other in this inquiry. Beauty, it is said, weds two conditions with one another which are opposite to each other, and can never be one. We must start from this operation. We must grasp and recognize them in their entire purity and strictness, so that both conditions are separated in the most definite manner. Otherwise we mix, but we do not unite them. Secondly, it is usual to say, beauty unites those two opposed conditions, and therefore removes the opposition. But because both conditions remain eternally opposed to one another, they cannot be united in any other way than by being suppressed. Our second business is therefore to make this connection perfect, to carry them out with such purity and perfection that both conditions disappear entirely in a third one, and no trace of separation remains in the whole. Otherwise, we segregate, but we do not unite. All the disputes that have ever prevailed and still prevail in the philosophical world respecting the conception of beauty have no other origin than their commencing without a sufficiently strict distinction, or that it is not carried out fully to a pure union. Those philosophers who blindly follow their feeling and reflecting on this topic can obtain no other conception of beauty, because they distinguish nothing separate in the totality of the sensuous impression. Other philosophers who take the understanding as their exclusive guide can never obtain a conception of beauty, because they never see anything else in the whole than the parts, and spirit and matter remain eternally separate, even in their most perfect unity. The first fear to suppress beauty dynamically, that is, as a working power, if they must separate what is united in the feeling. The others fear to suppress beauty logically, that is, as a conception, when they have to hold together what in the understanding is separate. The former wish to think of beauty as it works, the latter wish it to work as is thought. The first fear to rob beauty of its freedom by a too strict dissection. The others fear to destroy the distinctness of the conception by a too violent union. But the former do not reflect that the freedom in which they very properly place the essence of beauty is not lawlessness, but harmony of laws, not caprice, but the highest internal necessity. The others do not remember that distinctness, which they, with equal right, demand from beauty, does not consist in the exclusion of certain realities, but the absolute including of all. That is not, therefore, limitation, but infinitude. We shall avoid the quicksands on which both have made shipwreck if we begin from the two elements in which beauty divides itself before the understanding, but then afterwards rise to a pure aesthetic unity by which it works on feeling, and in which both those conditions completely disappear. Letter 19. Two principal and different states of passive and active capacity of being determined. Bestimmbarkeit can be distinguished in man. In like manner, two states of passive and active determination, Bestimmung. The explanation of this proposition leads us most readily to our end. The condition of the state of man before destination or direction is given him by the impression of the senses is an unlimited capacity of being determined. The infinite of time and space is given to his imagination for its free use, and because nothing is settled in this kingdom of the possible, and therefore nothing is excluded from it, this state of absence of determination can be named an empty infiniteness, which must not by any means be confounded with an infinite void. Now it is necessary that his sensuous nature should be modified, and that in the indefinite series of possible determinations, one alone should become real. One perception must spring up in it, that which, in the previous state of determinableness, was only an empty potency, becomes now an active force, and receives contents. But, at the same time, as an active force, it receives a limit, after having been, as a simple power, unlimited. Reality exists now, but the infinite has disappeared. To describe a figure in space, we are obliged to limit infinite space. To represent to ourselves a change in time, we are obliged to divide the totality of time. Thus we only arrive at reality by limitation, at the positive, at a real position, by negation or exclusion, to determination by the suppression of our free determinableness. But mere exclusion would never beget a reality, nor would a mere sensuous impression ever give birth to a perception, if there were not something from which it was excluded. If by an absolute act of the mind the negation were not referred to something positive, and if opposition did not issue out of non-position, this act of the mind is styled judging or thinking, and the result is named thought. Before we determine a place in space, there is no space for us. But without absolute space, we can never determine a place. The same is the case with time. Before we have an instant, there is no time to us. But without infinite time, eternity, we should never have a representation of the instant. Thus, therefore, we can only arrive at the whole by the part, to the unlimited through limitation. But reciprocally, we only arrive at the part through the whole, at limitation through the unlimited. It follows from this that when it is affirmed of beauty, that it mediates for man the transition from feeling to thought. This must not be understood to mean that beauty can fill up the gap that separates feeling from thought, the passive from the active. This gap is infinite, and without the interposition of a new and independent faculty, it is impossible for the general to issue from the individual, the necessary from the contingent. Thought is the immediate act of this absolute power, which, I admit, can only be manifested in connection with sensuous impressions, but which in this manifestation depends so little on the sensuous that it reveals itself especially in an opposition to it. The spontaneity or autonomy with which it acts excludes every foreign influence, and it is not, as far as it helps thought, which comprehends a manifest contradiction, but only in as far as it procures for the intellectual faculties the freedom to manifest themselves in conformity with their proper laws. It does it only because the beautiful can become a means of leading man from matter to form, from feeling to laws, from a limited existence to an absolute existence. But this assumes that the freedom of the intellectual faculties can be balked, which appears contradictory to the conception of an autonomous power. For a power which only receives the matter of its activity from without can only be hindered in its action by the privation of this matter, and consequently by way of negation. It is therefore a misconception of the nature of the mind to attribute to the sensuous passions the power of oppressing positively the freedom of the mind. Experience does indeed present numerous examples where the rational forces appear compressed in proportion to the violence of the sensuous forces. But instead of deducing the spiritual weakness from the energy of passion, this passionate energy must rather be explained by the weakness of the human mind. For the sense can only have a sway, such as this, over man when the mind has spontaneously neglected to assert its power. Yet in trying by these explanations to move one objection, I appear to have exposed myself to another, and I have only saved the autonomy of the mind at the cost of its unity. For how can the mind derive at the same time from itself the principles of inactivity and of activity, if it is not itself divided, and if it is not in opposition with itself? Here we must remember that we have before us not the infinite mind, but the finite. The finite mind is that which only becomes active through the passive, only arrives at the absolute through limitation, and only acts and fashions in as far as it receives matter. Accordingly, a mind of this nature must associate with the impulse towards form or the absolute, an impulse towards matter or limitation, conditions without which it cannot have the former impulse nor satisfy it. How can two such opposite tendencies exist together in the same being? This is a problem that can no doubt embarrass the metaphysician, but not the transcendental philosopher. The latter does not presume to explain the possibility of things, but he is satisfied with giving a solid basis to the knowledge that makes us understand the possibility of experience. And as experience would be equally impossible without this autonomy in the mind, and without the absolute unity of the mind, it lays down these two conceptions as two conditions of experience equally necessary, without troubling itself any more to reconcile them. Moreover, this immanence of two fundamental impulses does not in any degree contradict the absolute unity of the mind. As soon as the mind itself, its selfhood, is distinguished from those two motors, no doubt these two impulses exist and act in it, but itself is neither matter nor form, nor the sensuous, nor reason. And this is a point that does not seem always to have occurred to those who only look upon the mind as itself acting when its acts are in harmony with reason, and who declare it passive when its acts contradict reason. Arrived at its development, each of these two fundamental impulsions tends of necessity and by its nature to satisfy itself. But precisely because each of them has a necessary tendency, and both, nevertheless, have an opposite tendency, this twofold constraint mutually destroys itself, and the will preserves an entire freedom between them both. It is therefore the will that conducts itself like a power as the basis of reality with respect to both these impulses. But neither of them can by itself act as a power with respect to the other. A violent man, by his positive tendency to justice, which never fails in him, is turned away from injustice, nor can a temptation of pleasure, however strong, make a strong character violate its principles. There is in man no other power than his will, and death alone, which destroys man, or some privation of self-consciousness, is the only thing that can rob man of his internal freedom. An external necessity determines our condition, our existence in time by means of the sensuous. The latter is quite involuntary, and directly it is produced in us, we are necessarily passive. In the same manner, an internal necessity awakens our personality in connection with sensations, and by its antagonism with them. For consciousness cannot depend on the will, which presupposes it. This primitive manifestation of personality is no more a merit to us than its privation is a defect in us. Reason can only be required in a being who is self-conscious, for reason is an absolute consecutiveness and universality of consciousness. Before this is the case, he is not a man, nor can any act of humanity be expected from him. The metaphysician can no more explain the limitation imposed by sensation on a free and autonomous mind than the natural philosopher can understand the infinite, which is revealed in consciousness in connection with these limits. Neither abstraction nor experience can bring us back to the source whence issue our ideas of necessity and of universality. This source is concealed in its origin in time from the observer, and its supersensuous origin from the researches of the metaphysician. But, to sum up in a few words, consciousness is there, and, together with this immutable unity, the law of all that is for man is established, as well as of all that is to be by man for his understanding and his activity. The ideas of truth and of right present themselves inevitable, incorruptible, immeasurable, even in the age of sensuousness, and without our being able to say why or how. We see eternity in time, the necessary following the contingent. It is thus that, without any share on the part of the subject, the sensation and self-consciousness arise, and the origin of both is beyond our volition, as it is out of the sphere of our knowledge. But as soon as these two faculties have passed into action, and man has verified by his experience, through the medium of sensation, a determinate existence, and through the medium of consciousness, its absolute existence, the two fundamental impulses exert their influence directly their object is given. The sensuous impulse is awakened with the experience of life, with the beginning of the individual, the rational impulsion with the experience of law, with the beginning of his personality. And it is only when these two inclinations have come into existence that the human type is realized. Up to that time, everything takes place in man according to the law of necessity, but now the hand of nature lets him go, and it is for him to keep upright humanity, which nature places as a germ in his heart. And thus we see that directly the two opposite and fundamental impulses exercise their influence in him, both lose their constraint, and the autonomy of two necessities gives birth to freedom.